Hello everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for coming along. So I am Rachel Austin. I work at the University of Western Australia as a research officer with Seagrass, and I'll talk to you guys a little bit today about seagrass in general, and then I'll go into a couple of seagrass restoration projects that have been done in Western Australia. I thought I'll start off with a little bit about me. So you know my background, how I got here, and in case you're interested in maybe following a similar path, this is one of the ways that you can do it. So I'm actually from down south. I grew up in Bunbury-Bustleton area, graduated high school down there. My gap year job was actually a tour guide at the underwater observatory at the end of the Bustleton Jetty. So that was a pretty amazing way to start my marine biology career. After that gap year, I went to UWA and did my bachelor's in marine science and zoology, and then I went straight on to my master's in marine biology. For my master's, my dissertation was actually looking at introduced and invasive invertebrates in the marine park down south, so things that are growing on the jetties, so very different from where I ended up now. So you can always change your mind, never stress about that. After my master's, I went and did a whole heap of traveling, caught up with friends, came back to Bustleton, and I was like, I really, really miss my science. So I was just, as you do, scrolling Facebook at work, and I found a volunteering opportunity, and it just happened to be Seagrass Restoration at UWA, and they are looking for volunteer divers for a trip to Shark Bay. And I jumped on that super quick and got the position, and I just never stopped bugging them. Eventually, my volunteering, I have my dive master qualification, I have my grade 1 coxswain certificate as well. And now I'm working as a research officer at UWA full time. So it's a little bit about me, but we'll move on to seagrasses now. So I'm not sure how much you guys know about seagrasses. I'll go over some points. Hopefully you learn a couple of things and it refreshes your memory. But the basic characteristics of seagrass are really, really important in determining what's the best way to tackle seagrass restoration for an area and that species. So seagrasses are plants. They are not seaweeds, they're not an algae, they are true plants that have migrated from land into the ocean. We can see in that photo there, we've got white roots coming off the rhizome or the runner. For this particular species, the leaves come off a stalk. Not all of them do. Sometimes it's like a true grass just in the ocean. You can also see for this species here, they have lots of pigments in their leaves to help protect them from lots of sunlight in very shallow waters. And that sort of purpley red pigment in particular is called anthocyanin. Now, seagrasses do have the ability to reproduce both asexually and sexually. So they are able to reproduce asexually with their rhizome extension, so just growing those runners as your normal lawn grasses do. But they still produce flowers. Underwater flowers are a bit different to your land flowers, and so is the pollen, but you still have that pollen pollinating the flowers. And depending on the species, this could turn into a seedling that floats away. It could turn into a fruit which floats around and then drops a seed. It could form a seed straight away that grows into a plant, or a seed which goes into this sandbank and is dormant for a while. So there's a lot of variation there with the species. Approximately 72 species worldwide, so not a huge amount. The number is a little bit contested. So the concept of a species is a human concept, and nature doesn't really abide by the strict rules and lines that we like to put in place. So sometimes something could look completely different, but that'd be the same, or they could look the same and be completely different in a genetic way as well. We have about 36 species of seagrass in Australia, and a lot of those are found in Western Australia. So that's a very, very high amount of species diversity of seagrass in the state. It's pretty much found nowhere else in the world. I was once showing a seagrass scientist from the Smithsonian Institute over in America, took him snorkeling off Rotto, and he was just absolutely gobsmacked at the variety that we have. So it's a pretty special place. Now you do get temperate and tropical species of seagrass. They can be fast or slow growing, and these tend to be related. Your temperate species tend to be slow growing and long living because it's a cold environment. They do have lower metabolisms at times, whereas your tropical species tend to be quite fast growing and what we call ephemeral. So they kind of come and go from different areas quite quickly, sometimes even just being present for a couple of months to a couple of years. They do tend to have quite a good seed bank which they can draw from. Now the name seagrasses does indicate that they live in the ocean, but they can be found in estuaries all the way up the Swan River just about. Lots of estuarine and freshwater systems do have grasses in them. They can also grow to hypersaline areas. So seawater is generally 35 salinity units, whereas we found them in places in Shark Bay where it's 55 salinity units and they're growing really, really well. So it's amazing the range of conditions that they can withstand. Now, being a plant that's photosynthesizing, they do require light. So they tend to be in shallow areas with clear water, but we do get some species that are adapted to living further down. You do get seagrasses in 40 metres of water off the back of Rottnest. And a couple of years ago, I was doing a bruv trip just off Gracetown, and we actually found some seagrass growing down there in like 60 or 80 metres of water, which was pretty amazing. And I thought I'd pop this in here. You may have seen a couple of weeks ago a story went a little bit viral about some seagrass in Shark Bay. And I was on the trip that did the sampling for this research, and we went up and down both gulfs in Shark Bay and collected a whole heap of samples. And then Jane, the master's student, went off and did all the genetic testing on them, and it took a while for them to sort out the results because they were really, really weird. But it turns out all of the seagrass of this Posidonia australis species is just one plant that has extended over the range of 180 kilometres in Shark Bay on both sides, and they're saying it's about 4,500 years old. So that was a pretty incredible project to sort of be a part of, and that photo that's gone with it is actually my photo that I took in Shark Bay on one of the trips. So that was a pretty amazing little week that we had. Now to the species that we tend to get around Perth quite often. We'll talk about them at the genus level. So we have the Posidonia species, and these are often referred to as strapweed or ribbonweed. You often see the long leaves washed up on the beach. They do naturally lose their leaves every couple of months, so it is a natural process. And the rack mounds that they build up on the beach, well, I know they can be quite smelly at times. They do actually house a huge range of ecosystems and animals in there, from birds to invertebrates, and they actually help protect the beaches in storms as well. Then you've got Amphibolus, or it's sometimes called wireweed. So this species of seagrass is a little bit different, as it has quite short leaves in what we call florets, or little groups coming off these very hard stems. And these stems are like wire, hence the name wireweed. And it can actually grow in kind of shallow, sandy, rocky areas. It actually has sort of some roots which we grab onto rocks. So it's a little bit of an odd one. If you've ever ducked your head in the river, I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but you may have actually found some seagrass there. It's a paddleweed, which we call Holophila, and it's quite a fast-growing species. Even in the river, it comes and goes a lot, but it's got lots of seeds in the sand, which it uses as a seed bank. So a few little things about what seagrasses do. I'm sure you're aware they provide food. It's more of this tropical species that the turtles and dugongs eat on. They provide shelter, so that might be places to hide, to sleep for other fish and invertebrates. Some species take it the next step further and use it as a nursery habitat, like your pink snapper. They'll spend the first few years in the seagrass meadows, and once they're bigger and stronger, then they'll move on to the offshore rocky reefs. They also help protect our coastlines, so the leaves actually slow down the water, and this helps to prevent beach and dune erosion. and they actually do help to purify pathogens. But it's important to remember that everything does have a threshold. It has a maximum, so if there's too much in the water, unfortunately, it's not likely to survive. Now, blue carbon, seagrass storing carbon sequestration, that's a big topic in sort of the climate change and seagrass world. This isn't totally applicable to all species of seagrass, but it is to the one that's most common here, which is the Posidonia, and that's the photo that we have there. Now you can see you've got like the green leaves, and then there's sand at the bottom, and in between that's what we call the rhizome mat. So these are the runners and roots and the dead organic material that's normally in the sand, buried, where it doesn't get light or oxygen, so the bacteria doesn't decompose it. So that's locking, that's storing all that carbon away. However, if that's exposed for any range of reasons, from storms to dredging, then all of that is now sort of released and can be starting to release that carbon. So it's both a good thing and a bad thing in that sense. Something a lot of people forget, which seagrasses do, being a plant, is photosynthesize, and they actually produce a lot of oxygen, which is very important to anything alive, and the amount of oxygen they produce is often underestimated quite significantly. So there are lots of threats facing seagrasses, and I picked some ones that are quite specific to WA. We all know that the waters are starting to warm, and that can be quite a problem if you're already living in the area that's the warmest that you can generally tolerate. That, combined with the heat waves, can quite easily create devastating heat waves that kill a large proportion of the seagrass, and I'll show you a little bit about that later. Severe weather events can include your heat waves, but can also include like storms and cyclones. So those physical disturbances can be quite damaging. The tropical species, they're easily removed, but they often grow back pretty quickly. However, for your larger temperate species, which grow slow, while it does take a reasonable amount of force to sort of rip them up, it can take a very long time, and I'm talking decades, until they actually start to grow back. Now, altering water flow can be quite problematic for a number of reasons. A good example is sort of the Mangles Bay area, when they built that causeway over to Garden Island. That blocked a lot of the water flow, so not only was water not moving in and around, and that seems to have created a eutrophication algal problem, but it's also blocked a lot of fruit from going into that area, a lot of seed from getting to that area. So you don't have that input of new material, which can also be problematic. So there's different ways that altering the water flow can impact seagrasses. Sedimentation, so that is just quite literally sediment in the water, sand, particulates, all that kind of stuff. It does block a lot of sunlight, and if it blocks too much, then the seagrass will stop to grow. It can also settle onto the leaves, further blocking it, but in a more permanent way. If it's just a short amount of time, they're generally okay, but if it persists for weeks to months or even years, then we'll really start to see some negative impacts. And this can be from river runoff, just from a storm, every time a big ship goes past, and of course dredging is a really big one. Speaking of sort of river runoff, anything that's coming off the land often has a lot of nutrients being washed into the waterways, and some of this is from sort of your more domestic uses, but also there's industry, and that has caused problems in the past, which I'll talk about later. As you can see, we've got boats there, and this is actually an image I took in Shark Bay of our research vessel up in one of the gulfs. You can see it's pretty shallow. There's not much room between the bottom of the boat and the seagrass. We know our seagrass sites very well, and we're able to navigate and anchor appropriately around them. However, a lot of boaters don't. They see a patch of seagrass and go, oh, perfect place to chuck the anchor in. However, if you're throwing an anchor in a big seagrass meadow over at Rottnest, you could be doing damage that would take decades to recover. And you do see lots of scars in seagrass meadows, big long lines of where the chains just ripped all the seagrass out, or circles around moorings where the chains also rip the seagrass out. So I'll talk now about some of the restoration projects I've been involved with here in our own backyard. And I'll start off with Shark Bay. It's a lovely place. Hopefully you guys have been there or can go soon. So up in Shark Bay, they are the dominant ecosystem, and pretty much all the recreation, tourism, the fishing, all that kind of stuff. The whole community really relies on these seagrass meadows and what they produce. And we've been working with the local Indigenous rangers, the Mulgana people, and we've been working with them, sharing knowledge, sharing experiences, getting to know each other, but also carrying out actual restoration. And we've been trying both seed and shoot-based research, which I'll get into. So in case you're not aware, there was a very large marine heat wave in 2011. And in Shark Bay, that kind of resulted in dramatic, devastating seagrass losses. So water temperatures were sort of 4 to 5 degrees higher than normal for a couple of months. And this resulted in, I think, somewhere between like 70 and 80% of seagrass loss. You can see in this image here, if you just look at the one with all the red on it, that's all the loss that happened between 2002 and 2014. And some monitoring shows that this is primarily due to the heat wave. The heat wave was also in conjunction with a flooding event. So the Wurrumal River flooded and caused a lot of suspended sediment blocking that light. So it was a bit of a double whammy, and it has resulted in a huge amount of seagrass loss. Now, DBCA do a lot of monitoring up there, and we go up there a lot, and we have seen recovery at some sites, but it is fairly small. And we know that the seagrasses in Shark Bay are at the northern limit of their temperature distribution, and they're only going to be facing more threats as time progresses. So we need to step in and we need to start helping them recover from these disturbances. And if we can do it in a way that actually makes them stronger for the future, that would be a really smart thing to do as well. So seagrass restoration is actually quite simple. In this case, it's using transplants or sprigs. So I'm holding one of the transplant units there underwater. So all we do is literally dig up a small section of the seagrass at the growing edge. It's really important that it's the growing portion at the edge. That means it's going to grow a lot better and faster compared to something you grab in the middle. So we pull it up and we remove all the roots, because unfortunately they die once they're in salt water. But by removing the roots, we are sort of promoting them to grow new ones. And all we do to plant them is dig a little hole, put them in the right way around, and we use little metal pegs just out of wire, bent wire, to secure them so that the tides and wind waves don't wash them away. These pegs will rust away in a year or two, and by that time they will have established a good root system, so they're not in danger of being washed away. So we can see one of our transplant experiments there. This was when we just put it in. Each transplant unit was sort of just 3 or 4 shoots. A shoot could have multiple leaves, but you can see they're kind of on the small side there in that big sandy patch. Give them a couple of years of growth though, and there's so many shoots, it's so hard to count. I was getting up to 20, almost 30 shoots. And so this is the Posidonia australis on the left-hand side. So these were the ones where they only had 3 or 4 shoots. Now they've got 10 to 20. But the really good thing to note is not only they survived, and we did have very high survival, 80 to 90% of them survived, which is great, which is very, very high compared to a lot of other restoration programs that have been conducted in the world. But you can see we've got other little species growing in amongst them. We've got fish there, we've got some algae growing there. So not only have we created seagrass, but we're actually starting to restore the ecosystem and ecosystem function. And that's the whole goal that we have. And so after just a couple of years, we can actually show this. On the right-hand side there is the other genus that I mentioned, Amphibolus. And so we did the same for Amphibolus as well. Again, they were planted with just sort of 3 to 4 shoots each. And within 2 years, you can see how much they've grown. It's just amazing to see. And these ones in particular that you can see of the amphibolus were planted by the Mulgana Indigenous Rangers. So they're out there doing the seagrass restoration with us. The amphibolus is a little bit special. It produces from the flower a seedling, which then directly develops into the plant. So on the left-hand side there, this is one of the amphibolus seedlings. And you can see down the bottom, there's kind of this grappling hook structure. And what happens is this seedling floats along for a couple of days. And when it's ready, it's like, yep, okay, I'm going to sink to the bottom. It'll go down and use that grappling hook structure to grab onto something and then shoot roots down as quickly as it can and then start to grow from there. And they produce millions and millions and millions of these seedlings every year. But you've probably seen them washed up on the beach, and of course, they're not going to grow on the beach. So if we could very simply just increase the number of attachment points for these amphibolus seedling hooks, then in theory, we would be able to increase the amount of amphibolus that's growing. So 2 years ago, I think it was, we started with these hessian bags because hessian will naturally degrade over a year or two. So we want it to be there enough that the seedling will get established, but we don't want to have a structure that we've got to remove later on. And you can see on that right-hand picture that there's a couple there, but the bags quickly split apart and didn't really work. So we kind of redesigned our bag idea into something called seagrass snaggers. So they're still hessian snacks, but we've just changed the shape. So they're about 20 centimetres wide and 2 metres long, and we fill them with beach sand. They weigh about 20 kilos each, so definitely get your work out doing this. And we worked with the Mulgana Rangers in March, and we deployed 100 of these, and we arranged them in rows about 4 or 5 metres apart. And so we ended up covering area over 2,500 square metres with these bags. And I fly to Shark Bay on Sunday, and we're going to go deploy more of these bags next week off Monkey Mia, and we'll go and have a look at other bags that we deployed in March just off Denham. This is completely new. This has literally never been done in the world, never been done in seagrass restoration. We are trying to develop a way to restore these. So while there's lots of science out there, we absolutely don't know everything, and there's still a huge amount to learn, and sometimes it is just trial and error. So now I'll talk about our Seeds for Snapper program, which you may have heard of. It operates out of Perth in Cockburn Sound. We're generally based at Woodman Point, and it works with Ozfish and Wreckfish West, and we've had some incredible success over the couple of years, and so we will be getting other people coming on board this year. So it's going to be a very big and exciting year for Seeds for Snapper. However, it wasn't all lovely news in Cockburn Sound. If you have a look at those photos there, just pay attention to the black. You can see in the top left, there's a lot of black, but in the bottom right, there's pretty much none, and that's seagrass gone. So over the space of about 25 years, they lost almost 80% of the seagrass in Cockburn Sound, which is a huge amount. And it was definitely noticed by everyone the impacts it was having, particularly on the fisheries, of course. Why did this happen? The correct answer would be poor water quality, and there's a ranges of sources for this poor water quality. A lot of them were pollution and industry. So a lot of new laws and regulations have been put in, and the water quality has improved significantly. It's not perfect, but it's definitely on the way. However, we haven't really noticed much seagrass recovery in the past couple of decades since this occurred. So again, we're like, we need to step in, we need to hop in, and we need to help restore these seagrass areas. And this is where the Seeds for Snapper program developed in conjunction with Ozfish and Wreckfish West. Seagrass is a prime nursery habitat for the snapper, so everyone loves their snapper, but we won't have any if there's no seagrass. And it's always really, really good to be able to source your seagrass material for restoration in a way that's not going to negatively impact the seagrass that's existing. And Obviously, those transplants, digging that up, well, it does have a small impact. It is quite minor. It's gone within a couple of years. It obviously is quite labour intensive. So if there's a way that we can get a lot of material very easily, then that's the way to go. And this, in the case of our local seagrass, Posidonia australis, is seagrass fruit and the seeds. And so we have our seeds for snapper. So we can see, I'm not sure if you guys can see my cursor, but we've got Posidonia australis with the fruit in this sort of first image. So in winter time, the seagrass will produce a flower which is pollinated, and if that's successful, it will develop into a fruit containing a seed. In sort of October, November, December, this fruit matures, and when it's fully mature, it will release, it will pop off from the adult plant and float along the surface for a couple of days. It's actually still photosynthesizing, but that fruit traps all of the oxygen that's produced and eventually will split open and release the seed. Now the seed has a really cool hydrofoil or fin on it that helps it swim down in a literal spiral fashion and plants itself on the bottom, and then that fin helps it to stabilize because it only needs about 24 to 48 hours until the root can be put out. However, about 90% of the fruit that these seagrasses produce is lost naturally. So some of that's just washed out to sea. If you've got your strong easterlies blowing, it will get out past Rottnest and Garden Island, and it's too deep, too rocky out there to survive. But most of it washes up on the beach, and in that hot midday sun, it's dead within a couple of hours. So what we're trying to do is collect this fruit before it's released. So we can see we've got these specially made nets, and all we do is kind of rub or tickle the flowers, stalks, and the fruit will come up into these nets where it's collected. We collect all this fruit, we do kind of count it out roughly so we have an idea of what we're taking, and then we put it in these very big tanks. And these are open tanks in the sense that we have seawater continually being pumped in and out, and it's rotating because we're trying to mimic the surface of the ocean, that movement with the wind and the waves. After a couple of days, the fruit will again split open and release the seed to the bottom of the tank, where we've got a valve which we can open to get all the seed out. We do rough counts so we know how many seeds are going into which restoration plot, but because they've got that special hydrofoil fin, sort of a membrane, all we have to do is throw them over the edge of the boat in a sort of feeding the chickens manner, and this results in quite a good distribution of the seagrass seeds on the floor. Now that last sort of photo at the bottom is after just a couple of days. They shoot out the leaves very, very quickly, and the roots as well. It can take just a couple of days to get to that stage. After a couple of weeks, this is what they look like on the left-hand side. They are fairly established, and we've got some leaves, we've got some roots. So sort of 8 to 12 weeks, that's how old those ones are from this year. And then after a couple of years, they're looking like mini seagrass plants now. And once they get to that stage, we're pretty happy, we're pretty confident that they're going to survive and grow into a nice meadow. So a lot of the seagrass seedlings that are made either naturally or for restoration purposes, they get washed away in the winter time. So if they survive the winter, we're pretty confident they're going to survive and grow into a nice new meadow. But of course, how does this compare to what happens naturally? Are we just sort of replicating what happens naturally? Are we doing a worse job, or are we doing a better job? And they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, and in this case, it definitely is. So you can see the restoration site, it's got heaps and heaps of seedlings growing there, super duper dense. We've got a nice clump there. Control site, we have a whopping 1. And sometimes we're lucky to get 1. So we don't need a huge complex statistical test to tell us that our restoration site is doing much better than what happens at the control sites. A few numbers from our Seed for Snapper program last year, where we saw a huge number of community divers get involved, and that's why we're able to do this, because we have beautiful people from the community wanting to help and get involved in seagrass restoration. And it's super simple and easy to get involved. Not all science is hard lab work or very tedious work. Some of it is super simple and fun, which I love. So last year for Seeds for Snapper, we collected over 1.18 million fruit, and that was a huge amount. It was an overwhelming amount. I definitely wasn't expecting that, and we definitely upgrading our equipment for this year. We had some unfortunate fruit death because we didn't have enough space for our magnificent volunteer efforts. So we only got about 375,000 seeds dispersed. Our goal for this year is 1 million seeds. And just to give you an idea of how much the community has been getting involved, they've donated over 1,000 hours. We've had 300 dies from them. We've got the standard Facebook page. We've got 645 members, and that quite easily doubled just in the last few months. So it's pretty amazing. But what would be even more amazing is if you guys can get involved. I want to formally invite you guys to come and be a part of Seeds for Snapper, to get involved. There's lots of different ways that you can do it. So whether you're a water or a land person, there's lots of different ways that you can get involved. If you are a marine water orientated person, you can definitely get involved in the in-water collections if you have the correct scuba or free diving certifications. And this is run by an Ozfish diver volunteer program. So you're able to sign up and register for sessions. So if you've got your diving or free diving certs, you can come in and help us collect the actual fruit. We do have a lot of counting that needs to be done, which isn't as bad. I'm not saying we count to a million fruit. We take a sort of a 2 litre bucket, we count out the number of fruit in that, and then we scale up for how many 2 litre buckets we have. It's really, really important that we get these metrics so we know how much we're taking out. We know sort of our unit effort costs. So if we have one diver, we generally get X number of fruit, and this way we can work out what we're looking at in terms of collections and costs. There's also quite a lot of sorting to do because the fruit and the seed can sometimes end up together, but we need to just disperse the seed, not the dead fruit. So we do have to do some sorting. There's some tank stuff. We do need to keep the tanks nice and clean. And again, a little bit of counting with the seeds. So we need to know how many seeds are going out to each of our site. Knowing that density, even if it's just a rough estimate, we are then able to calculate our survival, and we can know whether we've had good success or bad success at a site. But of course, we end up with so many seeds towards the end as they're all starting to ripen and mature that we do need help dispersing them. And that's something where we hope to get the local fishermen if their boat's involved. So I'd really love it if, and I've spoken to your teacher as well, and who'd be keen to get involved. I do hear that you guys are finishing in October, which is totally fine. You can still come and help us as well. But we would really like to see you guys getting out and about and helping us with Seeds for Snapper. And we are hoping to expand the program to amphibolous seedlings as well, but watch this space. So that's all from me. That's my email address down at the bottom. So if you've got any questions or queries or anything, feel free to email me. I will reply as soon as I can. That photo there is taken on the job. We go to Karnak Island to collect a lot of the seagrass fruit for that Seeds for Snapper program. And of course, there's the sea lions on the beach there. And if they're feeling like it, they'll come out and have a swim. The young ones in particular are very, very curious. They absolutely love to come and have a play and get very, very inquisitive. So, well, I can't promise you would have a beautiful sea lion interaction if you do come and volunteer for Seeds for Snapper and come out on one of our Karnak days. We hire boats for you guys to get over there. You've got the chance of that as well. So thank you guys so much for listening. I'll exit this presentation and then we can answer any questions. How's that?
Yeah, just a question on the Seagrass, the Seeds for Snapper program. What's the time frame for those that are interested in volunteering and things like that? Obviously, it has to rely on when the seagrasses are germinating. So what time frame does this happen for like collecting and dispersing and things like that?
Yeah, so it does depend on winter a little bit. Last year was quite a wet winter, so it was delayed a little bit. Generally, in October, towards the end of October, we'll start and do our preliminary surveys to see where the fruit is, how quickly it's maturing. And then we say from the 1st of November is when the season starts for about 6 weeks into mid-December. That's where we concentrate all of our efforts. So sort of the 6 weeks from November to mid-December is the peak is generally within there somewhere, unless nature decides to throw us a big curveball and we have to adapt on the spot.
Okay, we just got a question over here. Unfortunately, we're tethered. Can you see Remy?
Yeah.
Ask away, Remy.
Who is funding seagrass transplant restoration in WA, and how much does it cost for an area like Shark Bay?
That's a very good question. The Australian Research Council, so the ARC, they do grants. There is NESP, which is another national funding program. And then you also get funding from smaller local organisations like your Recfish West. You get some people, so for example, with Seeds for Snapper, some of the Coburn companies are getting involved. And then there's lots of philanthropic donations as well. So that's where people like Twiggy and Jotcloth do come into it. So there's a wide range of funding. The cost is quite variable. So you're definitely talking in the tens of thousands of dollars. Seeds for Snapper is proving to be more economical in that term because we have quite an easily accessible area with the fruit being quite easy to get, and we've got the community people to volunteer their time. However, it gets much more expensive when you go up to Shark Bay because you're having to hire cars, hire boats, you've got to pay people for their time and also the equipment. So it can vary anywhere from thousands to tens of thousands just to do a trip.
Can you hear Andy at the back? Oh, Andy?
I can't, sorry.
Is the seagrass loss more widespread than just Coburn Sound?
Did you hear that?
Yes, I did. Unfortunately, yes and no. So the worst of it is in Coburn Sound, but there is more to the south. Seagrass Bay is actually a fairly healthy, stable area. There has been a lot of loss down in Albany as well, and significant restoration projects have been done down in Albany with great success as well. Most seagrass restoration focuses on the temperate species, so your Amphibolus and your Posidonia, because they're the long-lived, slow-growing species that take a while to come back and need extra help, whereas with the tropical species, because they move around so much and they're much harder to restore, but also they can adapt a bit better.
One question from me. The West Australia is quite, sparsely populated in comparison to a lot of coastlines. Are there areas globally that have experienced like more dramatic seagrass losses?
Yeah, there's definitely been huge amounts of loss around the world. I mentioned a Smithsonian researcher. They do a lot of work up in Chesapeake Bay, and they had similar problems with lots of nutrient inputs. And they've really cleaned up that area. And over the past sort of 10, 20 years, they've seen incredible results from their restoration programs. So there are places around the world that do experience huge losses, but there are some pretty amazing successful programs out there too.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rachel. It's really good to hear that your own career started off in this volunteering space, and I'm sure it's going to inspire a lot of students to persist with putting in those hours towards something that they love. And, it's awesome to see the good things that can come out of it as well.
Thank you so much for having me.